October wrapped the quiet town of Willowridge in a gray mist, as fine rain traced soft lines across its weathered streets. The kind of rain that didn't pour but lingered, like a gentle sorrow that wouldn't quite let go. At the back entrance of Rowan and Finch, a quaint little bookshop with shelves that smelled of old pages and forgotten stories, Clara Whitmore pulled a trash bag into the alley. Her yellow raincoat had seen better days. Its sleeves were frayed, its color faded. Her damp hair clung to her cheeks. Her boots made faint, tired sounds as they pressed into the puddles. She paused, letting the cold air fill her lungs. Above her, crimson maple leaves quivered on their branches, trembling as if reluctant to fall. There was something sacred in that moment, a fragile stillness that held both beauty and grief. And then came the sound. Not loud, not sharp, just a small, fractured sob, like something breaking quietly in the dark. Clara froze. It came again, from deeper in the alley. A man's voice, but barely. The kind of cry someone makes when they're trying not to be heard. She let the bag drop, the thud muffled by the wet ground. Slowly, almost reverently, she moved toward the sound, guided by instinct more than reason. Under the dim flicker of a distant street lamp, she saw him. He was folded in on himself near a dumpster, his black suit clinging to him in the rain. Expensive, but soaked through like it no longer belonged in this place. Mud stained his once polished shoes. In his hand, he clutched a gold ring. Another lay near his foot, glinting faintly on the pavement, like a memory someone couldn't hold on to anymore. He didn't raise his head. His shoulders trembled with each breath, every sob a silent war between pride and pain. Clara stood still, watching. She didn't need to know his name to understand what he felt. That hollow weight in the chest, the silence that follows something irreversible. She had felt it too, 7 years ago, in a hospital hallway, staring at 3 names on a death report, her parents and little brother, all gone in a crash that shouldn't have happened. Or 3 years ago, when the man she once dreamed of marrying stood in their kitchen, arms around her closest friend. Grief didn't always scream. Sometimes it sat quietly in an alley, wearing a suit and trying not to fall apart. And maybe that's why she stepped forward. Not because she knew what to say, but because sometimes just showing up mattered more than words. She knelt beside him. The rain soaked through her jeans, the cold bit at her knees, but she didn't move. She was simply there. And for now, that was enough. Without saying a word, Clara placed her hand gently on the man's shoulder, the same way she used to comfort lost children wandering the bookstore, eyes wide with fear, searching for someone familiar. He flinched at her touch. His head lifted slightly, just enough for her to catch a glimpse of tear-filled eyes, raw and blurred by grief and rain. Then, as if the weight of being seen was too much to bear, he looked away again, his gaze falling, shoulders folding tighter. Still, Clara didn't leave. She stepped closer and wrapped her arms around him. The hug wasn't forceful, just enough for him to know someone was there, someone who wasn't afraid of his brokenness. The scent of his cologne lingered in the damp air, mingling with the smell of wet pavement and rusted metal, a strange, unforgettable blend of sorrow and something once elegant. "You don't have to say a word," she whispered, her voice low but steady. "I'm here. That's all." He didn't answer, but his body slowly gave in, the tension in his shoulders softening. His sobs became quieter, fading into the rhythm of the rain around them. They stayed that way for a while, two people without names, without stories, joined not by identity, but by an ache they both seemed to understand. Clara didn't ask who he was, didn't press him for explanations. Some wounds didn't need questions. Some pain only needed presence. Eventually, his crying stopped, not abruptly, but like the tide pulling away from the shore, still there, but quieter. She released him gently. He didn't meet her eyes, just wiped his face with a soaked sleeve and sat still. She stood, ready to walk away. But then something caught her eye. The wedding ring lay there, cold and small, glimmering faintly beneath the street lamp like a forgotten promise. She bent down, her fingers brushing the wet gold, without really knowing why. Maybe out of instinct, maybe something else. She slipped the ring quietly into the pocket of his jacket. No words, no explanation. Then she turned and walked back toward the bookstore. The rain hadn't stopped. It kept falling steadily, like a song with no lyrics, only feeling. She looked back once. The man remained where she'd left him, still, silent. But the ring was no longer on the ground. It was with him now. And maybe that was enough. Inside, the scent of paper and wood welcomed her home. Clara peeled off her raincoat and hung it on the familiar hook near the door, revealing a soft gray sweater beneath. She ran her fingers through her soaked hair, droplets slipping down her arms. A quiet sigh left her lips, not of regret, but something deeper, a release. This wasn't the first time she'd offered comfort without being asked, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. She didn't need recognition or thanks. Helping strangers had become her way of keeping her own heart from going numb. At 29, Clara was gentle, thoughtful, and outwardly calm. But inside, she carried cracks that would never fully heal. 7 years ago, her life had split open on a cold highway when a drunk driver swerved into the car, carrying her parents and little brother. They were coming back from a short trip to Trillium Forest, a trip she was meant to join. If not for a weekend shift at Rowan and Finch, she hadn't gone, and she had lived. But every night since, she'd carried the weight of what if. And just when the ache had started to quiet, 3 years later, the person she trusted most tore open that scar again. Ethan, the man she'd once imagined forever with, and Lena, her best friend from childhood, standing too close in the kitchen of the apartment she and Ethan had chosen together. 2 months before their wedding, she had walked out that same night, returned the ring, vanished from their lives without looking back. Since then, Clara had kept her world small, just the bookstore, the stories in its pages, and the strangers who walked through its door. She didn't seek connection, but if someone was lost, she would be there. Silently, gently, the way no one had been there for her, because sometimes kindness was the only way to survive. For Clara, kindness wasn't something she performed. It was the quiet rhythm that kept her heart beating, the thread that tethered her to the world after so much had been lost. When she gathered books to send to children in remote parts of rural Oregon, or helped an elderly customer find the right poem to say goodbye to a loved one, she wasn't just giving. She was healing one gesture at a time. The following morning, Willow Ridge stirred to an unusual buzz. The rain had lifted, leaving tiny mirrors of water shimmering across sidewalks and tree roots. The scent of wet soil hung gently in the crisp air, promising a brief pause in the endless drizzle. Inside Rowan and Finch, Clara stood behind the counter, idly flipping through the yellowed pages of an old guide to Northwest trees. The shop was quiet, wrapped in the hush of early morning. That peace, however, didn't last long. "Clara, look at this," came the voice of Jade, her spirited coworker with cropped black hair and emerald eyes that missed nothing. Jade slapped the newest issue of Willow Ridge Weekly onto the counter with a loud thud, her face alight with intrigue. Across the front page, bold letters screamed, "Tech tycoon abandoned before I do. Fiancé disappears hours before ceremony." Below the headline, a grainy photo showed a man in a tuxedo standing alone before an extravagant, empty reception table. Clara scanned the article. The man, Adrian Vale, 32, founder of one of the country's fastest-growing tech companies, had been left standing at the altar during a high-profile wedding in downtown Portland. His bride had vanished just 2 hours before the ceremony. No note, no explanation, just gone. Jade laughed softly. "They say he's a total ice king. Guess someone finally got tired of melting him." Clara gave a faint smile but said nothing. Gossip didn't interest her, but the name Adrian Vale landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of something she couldn't name. She gently closed the book in her hands and turned her attention back to sorting a stack of children's titles, preparing them for a delivery to Crescent Hollow Community Library by week's end. Outside the bookstore, the story caught fire. By noon, every cafe in town was humming with speculation. At Finch and Folly, the popular coffee house down the street, baristas poured oat milk over espresso while customers debated whether the heiress-to-be had cold feet or a secret lover. On social media, the hashtag #LeftByVale was trending, accompanied by paparazzi snapshots of the jilted groom leaving the hotel expressionless, hidden behind dark glasses. But no one knew the truth. No one knew that just nights earlier, he had sat soaking in the rain, shoulders trembling, hiding in the alley behind St. Elias Church. And Clara, the woman who had held him without question, had no idea that the man the world was now obsessed with was him. 3 days later, the bell above the bookshop door chimed. Clara, perched halfway up a wooden ladder, was carefully stacking hardcover novels when she heard the footsteps measured, steady, unfamiliar. She turned, and her breath caught. A tall man stood by the entrance, wrapped in a charcoal wool coat. No longer rain-soaked, no longer collapsed in the shadows. His dark hair was combed neatly, and the bruised red around his eyes had faded. But the exhaustion remained in the heaviness of his gaze, the slight sag of his posture. In his hand was a crumpled note. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low, hoarse like it hadn't been used in days. "Do you have The Alchemist?" Clara descended the ladder slowly. Her heart moved before her mind could catch up. It wasn't the tabloid photo that told her who he was. It was the way he stood. That same quiet weight in his shoulders. That same sorrow he'd tried to swallow in the rain. He was the man from the alley. The man she had held for no reason other than he needed it. And now, here he was again, asking for the very book she had whispered about that night, as if some invisible thread had led him back to her. Clara hadn't expected him to remember. She certainly hadn't expected him to walk through the door of her quiet bookstore like a question left unfinished. "I take it you hug strangers in alleys often," Adrian Vale said. His voice dipped in wry sarcasm, though his eyes softened with something more curious than cold. Or was I just the lucky one? A shadow of a smile played on his lips, the first she'd seen, and just as quickly it disappeared. Clara froze for a moment, a flicker of warmth rising to her cheeks. She wasn't used to this kind of conversation, sharp, direct, laced with a humor she didn't quite know how to return. Only when they look like they need it, she replied quietly, then turned away to hide the blush blooming on her face. Her steps led her toward the classic literature section, though her thoughts spun in every direction. He's Adrian Vale. The man from the alley is Adrian Vale. Before she could reach for the book he'd asked for, a voice rang out from across the store. "Hey, isn't that the guy who got ditched?" A customer young, round glasses, voice far too loud for discretion nudged his friend, nodding toward Adrian. The whisper was like a match struck in dry air. Murmurs followed, along with a few sideways glances and poorly hidden stares. Clara saw the shift immediately. Adrian's hand tightened around the note he was still holding. His jaw tensed. Behind the calm surface, something in him was bracing, hardening, as if preparing for impact. Without hesitation, Clara stepped forward, gently touched his sleeve, and guided him toward a narrow aisle tucked behind the sci-fi section. The shelves there were tall and thick with hardcovers perfect for disappearing. "Don't mind them," she murmured. "This town loves a little drama. But give it a week. They'll move on to something else." Adrian looked at her, then really looked. Not like a stranger, or a subject of gossip, but as someone who saw through the noise. "You seem used to saving people," he said. His tone had changed lower, steadier, stripped of sarcasm. "Let's say I am," Clara answered, a gentle edge to her voice as she turned toward the shelf. She pulled out a worn copy of The Alchemist, the one she'd been thinking about since the night in the rain. "This is my favorite edition," she said, handing it to him. "It's not new, but it has soul." His fingers brushed the cover, almost reverently. "Thank you," he said simply. Their hands lingered for a moment longer than necessary. Neither mentioned the hug. Neither needed to. It lived in the quiet between them, unspoken, undeniable. When Adrian finally left, the bell above the door chimed softly. Clara stood frozen, a book still in her hand, watching through the wide glass window as he stepped out into the street. His figure disappeared into the morning crowd, tall, steady, unknowable. Adrian Vale, she thought, the name now real, tangible. But to her, he wasn't the tech mogul or the abandoned groom from the headlines. He was still the man in the alley, the one who had left behind a gold ring and a silence she hadn't been able to forget. At 32, Adrian Vale was a man built of logic and ambition. The world knew him as a visionary, the brilliant mind behind a rising tech empire based in downtown Portland. Cold, private, untouchable. But few knew the boy he once was raised in a house where affection was a luxury and love something you learned to survive without. Sophia, the woman he almost married, had grown weary of the media circus, of his distance, of the walls he didn't know how to lower. So she left, quietly. Without warning, it had shattered something in him. Not just the plan, but the illusion of control he had so carefully constructed. For the first time in years, he didn't know how to fix what had broken. And then, in a rain-soaked alley, behind a forgotten church, someone held him without question, without reason. That moment had stayed with him. And that's why he'd come back. Not just for the alchemist, but for the one who had handed him a moment of light when everything else had gone dark. Their embrace in the rain had been brief, yet it lingered like a line from a book that stays with you like The Alchemist, or any classic about the quiet search for meaning. At first, Adrian Vale returned to Rowan and Finch with the pretense of browsing, a new title, a passing question about local authors. Their conversations were tentative, often beginning with books and ending in silence, but not the uncomfortable kind. Clara didn't mind. In those moments of shared quiet, something unspoken passed between them. While Adrian flipped through pages with a steady, focused calm, Clara would sort through donated boxes or scribble thoughts into her small, worn notebook. The bookstore lined with towering shelves, wrapped in the scent of old paper and rain-damp wood, became their meeting ground. Unscheduled, undemanding, just presence. Just two people who had once, unknowingly, touched each other's ache. Clara kept her distance, gentle but deliberate. She never asked why he came back, never probed beyond small talk, weather, literature. A passing mention of Willow Ridge's quirky coffee scene. What she offered him were books, stories that had once held her through dark seasons. The Alchemist remained her first recommendation. Then came Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning and The Night Circus, with its dream-like melancholy. Once, as Adrian flipped open his copy of The Alchemist, he turned to her and asked, "Do you actually believe that the universe helps us find what we want?" Clara looked up from her notebook, a small smile in her eyes. "I think," she said slowly, "that sometimes we have to help ourselves first, and then maybe the universe catches on." He didn't respond with words, just gave a small nod, but his gaze lingered a little longer that day, studying her, perhaps, or searching for something he wasn't quite ready to name. Not everyone felt as at ease with Adrian's growing presence. Jade, Clara's closest friend and co-worker, eyed him with open suspicion. At 25, Jade was blunt, artistic, and fiercely protective. Her cropped green hair matched the indie band shirt she wore under thrifted flannels. A silver nose ring glinted when she squinted skeptically. One afternoon, after Adrian had left following a quiet exchange about sci-fi authors, Jade pulled Clara aside behind the counter. "Clara," she said, voice low but pointed, "you do know who he is, right? Adrian Vale? That Adrian Vale. The one who made headlines for getting left at the altar." Clara didn't answer immediately. Jade crossed her arms, brows furrowed. "You really think he's just here for books? Billionaires don't randomly wander into used bookstores looking for soulmates." Clara sighed, closing the pen in her hand. "I'm not offering anything but book recommendations, Jade." "That's exactly what worries me," Jade said. "You're too kind. People take advantage of kind. I got burned once, remember? Guy said he was an artist, just needed help with rent. He disappeared the second I handed him cash." Clara nodded. She remembered. And she knew Jade meant well. "I don't think he's like that," she said gently. "But I'm not expecting anything either." Jade shrugged, the tension still in her eyes. "Just be careful, okay?" And with that, she walked back toward the return shelf, leaving Clara with a flicker of doubt, one that quickly faded as soon as she thought of Adrian's quiet presence in the rain. Their connection unfolded slowly, like two travelers learning to speak each other's language from opposite sides of an invisible wall. Then came the storm. That evening, Willow Ridge was swept in by gusty winds and sheets of cold rain sweeping off the Willilt River. Most people stayed in. Rowan and Finch was nearly empty. The bell above the door barely chimed as Adrian stepped in, his coat soaked through, dark curls dripping water onto the wooden floor. Clara looked up from the counter, surprised. "I thought you'd stay home in this weather," she said, half joking. He shrugged, his voice low. "Didn't really have anywhere else I wanted to be." And in that moment, something shifted. His mask cracked, not broken, but softened. The admission was quiet, almost accidental. Clara didn't reply. She simply offered him a towel for his coat and let the silence fill the space between them like a shared breath. Outside, the rain continued falling. Inside, under the glow of warm lamps and the hush of closing time, something began to grow slowly, quietly. Not yet love, but something like it. Outside, the rain traced silver lines across the bookstore's wide glass windows, the droplets flickering in the low light like tiny falling stars. Reflections danced softly on the wooden floor. Inside, all was quiet until Adrian Vale moved. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe something unspoken needed to be broken. He stepped toward the old coffee machine in the corner, a vintage relic from the 80s that the Rowan and Finch staff insisted on keeping, despite its temperamental nature. "Coffee?" he asked, lifting the stained glass pot with the uncertain grip of someone who clearly didn't make it often. Clara raised an eyebrow, amused. "Sure," she said. She'd never seen him try to wrestle with the machine. Truthfully, she wasn't entirely sure how it worked either. He poured beans in with hesitant fingers, pressed the wrong button twice, and accidentally dumped hot water across the counter. A dark blotch spread over the wood, steam rising with the scent of burned hopes. "Damn it," he muttered, clearly flustered the first time Clara had seen a crack in his calm. She couldn't help it. A laugh escaped her, clear, bright like wind chimes in still air. Adrian looked up, startled. Then slowly, a rare smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "I'm not that hopeless, am I?" Clara grinned. "You look like a kid doing chores for the first time." And under the soft golden lights of the bookshop, for the briefest moment, he looked at her differently, like a man who hadn't seen sunlight in a very long winter. Clara felt something shift inside her. She wouldn't admit it, not even to herself, but the weight in her chest seemed lighter. When the machine finally cooperated and the two of them sat across from each other with mismatched mugs of steaming coffee, something else gave way. "She left," Adrian said suddenly, eyes fixed on the swirling surface of his drink. "Not because she didn't love me, but because she couldn't take the pressure, the headlines, living with someone like me. She said I was cold, distant." His voice was flat, detached, as if he were telling someone else's story. "I don't blame her," he added, "but I don't know how to be different." Clara listened, her hands wrapped tightly around her mug for warmth and grounding. Then she spoke soft, but sure. "My fiancé cheated on me," she said, "with my best friend, 2 months before our wedding." Adrian looked up. His eyes met hers. "For a long time," she continued, "I thought it was because I wasn't enough. But I realized, sometimes, people hurt us for reasons that have nothing to do with us. I started helping others because it gave me somewhere to put the pain." For a moment, neither spoke. And in that quiet space between two bruised hearts, something unspoken passed acknowledgement, maybe, or the beginning of trust. When Adrian left, the rain still fell beyond the windows, soft and steady. Clara stood behind the counter and watched his silhouette disappear into the dark. She didn't know what exactly was beginning between them, but something was. Not dramatic, not certain, just a flicker, like the warm light that brushed over old pages in the quiet corners of the shop. And that, she thought, was enough for now. As November crept in with its amber skies and crisp air, the rhythm between Clara and Adrian settled into something unspoken, yet familiar. He came in often now. Neither of them called it anything. Neither of them needed to. Then one afternoon, he arrived with a small folded slip of paper and an unusual certainty in his step. It was quiet in the store. Clara was labeling a stack of old poetry collections when he placed the ticket in front of her. It was from the Willow Ridge Book Festival, the biggest literary event in the city. "Come with me," he said. His voice was steady, calm. Clara looked up, startled. Her eyes lit with surprise, then softened into a smile. "You know I hate crowds," she said, half teasing. "Thousands of people pressed into one convention center. Sounds like a mild panic attack waiting to happen." Adrian tilted his head slightly, not giving up. "I don't like them either," he admitted. "But I thought you'd enjoy the used book section. They've even got a corner for kids' books, the kind you send out." Clara hesitated. There was something different in his expression, not his usual cool restraint, but a sincerity that almost made her look away. Almost, but still. She declined, gently. "I'll think about it," Clara said, her tone carefully neutral. "But don't get your hopes up." She expected him to drop it. But Adrian Vale, the same man who had once hidden behind silence, didn't give up so easily. Over the next week, he appeared at Rowan and Finch almost every day, never mentioning the festival directly, but always bringing it closer. One afternoon, he casually mentioned an author she adored would be signing books there. Another day, he told her about a rare bookseller flying in from Europe with imports she'd once dreamed of finding. And once he simply stood beside her by the travel memoirs and asked, "Aren't you even a little curious?" She tried to resist. She really did. But his persistence was no longer annoying. It was oddly endearing. And slowly, without realizing, her excuses wore thin. Then came Saturday. He arrived not with a festival flyer, but a different one entirely. A small book donation event for children in rural Oregon, hosted at a quiet library outside the city. Clara looked at the flyer, then up at him. He didn't say anything, just waited. She sighed, setting her pen on the counter. "Fine, but just this. No festivals. No giant crowds." Adrian's face broke into something rare, a full, unguarded smile. "I knew you'd say yes." That day, the sky over Willow Ridge cleared for the first time in weeks. Sunshine filtered through branches still clinging to their last red-gold leaves as they drove toward the suburbs. Clara sat in the passenger seat of Adrian's sleek black SUV, feeling slightly out of place like a cat brought to a dog park. The bookstore was her comfort zone, not donation events or unexpected road trips. But beside her, Adrian seemed unusually calm. His hands relaxed on the wheel, a quiet ease in his presence. They arrived in a small town about 40 minutes away, where volunteers were already setting up tables outside the community library. The air smelled like wood smoke and fresh coffee from the cafe across the street. The scene was lively, but not overwhelming. Clara immediately felt herself breathe easier. She stepped out carrying a box of children's books she'd chosen from Rowan and Finch titles, like The Very Hungry Caterpillar, Charlotte's Web, Goodnight Moon. Stories that had soothed her once. Stories she hoped might do the same for others. Adrian, despite being clearly out of his element, didn't hesitate. He joined her at the table, helping her lay out the books. His fingers, usually so at home on a keyboard, were clumsy with the soft covers dropping a few, stacking others out of order. "You don't have to do this," Clara said softly. He gave a small shrug. "I didn't come to stand around." They worked quietly, side by side. Then came the children. A group of 5 or 6 little ones, bundled in bright jackets, ran over giggling. A girl with tight curls and curious eyes pointed at a copy of Where the Wild Things Are. "Can you read it to us, mister?" she asked. Adrian froze. He looked at Clara, a silent plea in his eyes. She, in turn, only grinned and handed him the book. "Go on," she whispered. "It's not that scary." He lowered himself into a small wooden chair, the kids gathering around him in anticipation. With an awkward pause, he began, his voice deep and hesitant. The night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind. He stopped, then attempting a monster growl, let out a sound that landed somewhere between a cough and a sneeze. The children burst into laughter. Clara, watching from the coffee table nearby, nearly spilled her latte from laughing. The sound rang out bright, open, real. Adrian looked up, mock scowling. What's so funny? But even he couldn't hold the frown. A smile tugged at his mouth as the kids cheered. "Again! Do the monster, mister!" This time, he tried harder, his expression exaggerated, his growl still clumsy, but more confident. A cup tipped over, unnoticed. Clara stood watching, sunlight spilling in through the cafe window behind him. And in that moment, she saw something she hadn't before. He wasn't the man from the tabloids, not the billionaire abandoned at the altar, not even the broken figure in the rain. He was just Adrian, a man trying awkwardly, genuinely to open himself up to the world again. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to meet him there. By late afternoon, the book donation event began to wind down. The Oregon sky burned with a soft orange glow, the sun slowly retreating behind distant hills. On the drive back to Willow Ridge, the car was quiet. Adrian Vale kept his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes forward. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke, his voice low, thoughtful. "I've never done anything like that before," he said. Clara turned to glance at him, surprised. "Like what?" He hesitated, then added, "Something for other people, with nothing in return." She blinked, a little caught off guard. "So why today?" His fingers tapped once against the steering wheel. "Because of you," he said simply. "You make it seem easy. Like kindness isn't some grand gesture, it's just who you are." She didn't respond right away, but she smiled. And in that quiet smile, something warm began to unfold, like the sunlight that had broken through the clouds earlier that same day. A few weeks passed, and with them, the usual rhythm returned until Adrian walked into Rowan and Finch one chilly morning with something unexpected. He wasn't holding a book. He wasn't even holding a question. He came with an idea. "I've been thinking about that donation event," he began, standing by the counter, his hands tucked in the pockets of his wool coat. "So I'm funding a mobile library, a small truck filled with books. It'll visit towns that don't get much access, places like the one we went to." Clara stared at him, stunned. "Are you serious?" He gave a quiet nod, then pulled something else from his pocket, a small, handcrafted wooden box. He slid it across the counter. "This is for you." Inside was a vintage book press, beautifully restored, carved from dark walnut, its details intricate and delicate. Clara's breath caught. She had once mentioned, in passing, her dream of restoring old books properly, of having a real tool for the delicate work she did. Her fingers trembled as she touched it. "Adrian, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to," he replied gently. "I just thought it belonged with someone who would use it well." After he left, Clara stood alone behind the counter, still holding the book press. The rare Portland sun filtered through the large window, warming the worn wooden shelves around her. And in that light, something shifted inside her. He was no longer just the man from the alley, and she was no longer just the girl who tried to heal others. Together, whether they knew it or not, they were building something quiet and good, even if it was only the beginning. Winter came early to Willow Ridge that year. The wind bit at the windows of the bookshop, rattling glass panes and creeping through the cracks of the old building. But inside Rowan and Finch, Clara's heart was lighter than it had been in years. She and Adrian had found a quiet rhythm. Their connection didn't have a name, nor did it need one. He visited regularly, sometimes bringing coffee from Finch and Folly, other times just standing by the shelves, asking about old books she loved. There was no romance in the traditional sense, but there was something honest between them, a slow-building trust, a shared tenderness that neither of them knew how to name, but both of them felt. For the first time since everything she'd lost, Clara began to believe she might have found something again, a place, a presence, a kind of peace. Then came the rain. A steady drizzle tapped on the roof of the bookshop one gray afternoon in late November. Clara was sorting a new delivery near the front counter when the door jingled softly. At first, she didn't look up. Then she felt it, a change in the air, a pressure, a weight. She looked toward the entrance and saw a woman, tall, poised, with long blonde hair tied back into a high twist. Her cream-colored fur coat brushed her knees. Her heels echoed sharply on the wooden floor. She didn't browse. She didn't hesitate. She headed straight toward the back of the shop, where Adrian stood, holding a worn copy of Dune. Clara's breath caught. "Alex," the woman called, her voice smooth, sharp at the edges. "We need to talk." Clara's hand froze on the spine of a book. She didn't have to ask. She knew. Sophia. The woman who had once stood at the altar and then walked away. Adrian set the book down. His posture straightened, his face stiffened, and when he turned, Clara caught a glimpse of something she hadn't seen in weeks. Anger. Sharp. Controlled. Rising fast behind those blue eyes. "Sophia," he said. Adrian's voice dropped several degrees, cutting through the stillness. "What do you want, Sophia?" Her name hung in the air like a ghost. Sophia took a step closer, her hands clasped in front of her, as if to keep them from shaking. "I'm sorry, Alex," she said softly. "I know I was wrong to leave. I panicked. The pressure, the cameras, all of it, I couldn't breathe." She swallowed, her eyes glistening now. "But I've thought about it. A lot. And I want to come back. I want to make things right." Her voice trembled on the edge of tears. But Adrian shook his head, sharp and immediate. "No, Sophia," he said, cutting her off. "You walked away. I accepted that. There's nothing left here for you." Sophia stood frozen, lips pressed tight. Her jaw clenched then, just before turning away. She whispered, under her breath, "You'll regret this." Clara hadn't meant to listen. She'd been in the back room, sorting a box of old classics she'd planned to shelve. But through the narrow crack in the door, she saw enough. Sophia's hand on Adrian's shoulder. The flicker of hesitation in his eyes, brief, but real. Something inside her pulled tight. Not jealousy. No, it wasn't that. It was something older, something deeper. That haunting question. Was she just a stand-in? A warm place for someone cold to rest until they healed and returned to what they truly wanted? Clara stepped back, steadying herself against a shelf. Her hand brushed against the worn copy of The Alchemist. She always kept close, a personal talisman. She ran her fingers over the cover as a familiar line echoed in her mind. When you want something, all the universe conspires to help you achieve it. But for the first time, it didn't feel true. Or perhaps the universe had been conspiring, just not for her. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Clara dropped a book, misfiled an order, even mixed up someone's drink from the store's tiny coffee counter. Her thoughts spiraled, each one sharper than the last, and when Adrian approached the front counter, his voice low with concern, "Are you okay?" She forced a smile. "Just tired." He didn't push, but his eyes, those eyes that once lit up while reading stories to children, now felt distant, heavy, like they were carrying something she couldn't reach. Was all of this, his visits, his stories, even the book press, just a way to forget Sophia? Was she merely a placeholder? The thought nestled into her mind like a thorn, small, sharp, relentless, and suddenly everything came back. The crash that stole her family, Ethan's betrayal, all the moments when she had believed and been wrong. "I can't do this again," she whispered to herself later that night. In her small apartment on the east side of Willowridge, Clara stood in front of her bookshelf. Her hand rested on The Alchemist again, tears gathering behind her eyes. She thought of Adrian's words. She couldn't handle how cold I was, and wondered, had he really shut that door with Sophia? Or was it still slightly open, just waiting for the right moment? She opened the book, searching for solace in her favorite line. But this time, it brought no comfort. She closed it gently, sat down at her desk, and began to write her resignation letter. Not just from Rowan and Finch, but from the quiet world she'd built in Willow Ridge. She'd once received a job offer from a nonprofit in Seattle focused on early education for underserved communities. She hadn't considered it seriously until now. Maybe it was time. Time to help others without risking her heart again. The next morning, Jade was the first to know. When Clara arrived early to hand in her resignation, Jade pulled her aside, arms crossed, voice tight with disbelief. "You're quitting?" she hissed. "Leaving everything behind just because some billionaire's ex showed up?" Clara sighed. "It's not about him." Jade narrowed her eyes. "Then what is it?" "It's about me," Clara said. "I've been here before, trusting someone, believing in something, and finding out I was just a convenience. I can't do that again." "You always help everyone else," Jade snapped. "You give, you listen, you heal. But when do you help yourself? Running off like this, is that healing?" Clara's voice was quiet but certain. "I'm not running. I just need space. Time to figure out what I want before I give anything else away." Jade turned away with a frustrated huff, but before walking off, she muttered under her breath, "Just don't disappear like a story left unfinished." "I'll miss you," Jade said, her arms crossed tightly, "but I hate that you're running away like this." Clara didn't answer. She couldn't not, with everything she felt threatening to crack open again. There were no words left that wouldn't unravel her completely. That night, after Rowan and Finch had closed, and the streets of Willowridge were quiet, she returned one last time. She used her staff key to slip through the side door, the same way she'd entered so many mornings before. She walked to the far corner, the quiet nook where Adrian always stood with a book in hand, surrounded by shelves and silence. There, she placed her worn copy of The Alchemist on the small table. Tucked inside was a simple note, written in her careful hand. Find your treasure. No explanation. No goodbye. She turned and walked away, taking only the book press he'd once given her, a small suitcase, and the version of herself she was still trying to piece together. The next morning, Clara boarded a Greyhound headed north. The rain returned just as the bus pulled onto the highway, streaking the windows in long gray ribbons. As Portland faded behind the hills, she stared out at the passing trees. Her heart felt strangely hollow but calm, like something had been cut away, and in its place, space had opened. She didn't know if she was running or healing. She only knew she couldn't stay. Not with the questions, not with the fear of being someone's second choice again. Back in Willow Ridge, Adrian walked into Rowan and Finch just a few days later, a cup of Stumptown coffee in hand and something unspoken in his chest, something he still didn't know how to name. But when he saw Jade behind the counter instead of Clara, he paused. No gentle smile, no quick wave, just Jade's narrowed eyes. She's gone, Jade said, sliding The Alchemist across the counter toward him. Left this for you. Adrian picked it up, opening to the inside where her handwriting waited. Find your treasure. He stood there for a moment, unable to move. For the first time in months, his chest felt hollow in a way he couldn't explain. Not because of Sophia, not even because she'd left, but because it was Clara, and she hadn't said goodbye. The day Clara left, Adrian had no idea. He'd been caught in meetings, reviewing logistics for the mobile library he had built because of her, because of what she stirred in him. But when he entered the bookstore that weekend, expecting a familiar moment of peace, he felt something was wrong. Jade was alone. No Clara, no warmth. She's gone, Jade said flatly. He blinked. Gone where? Seattle, she said with a shrug, a few days ago. She didn't say much, but I'd guess it had something to do with you. And your blonde ex. The words hit like a blow he wasn't braced for. He looked down at the book, still in his hands. The Alchemist. Find your treasure. And for the first time in his carefully constructed, calculated life, Adrian Vale felt panic. Real panic. He didn't stop moving after that. He left Rowan and Finch immediately, the book tucked into his coat like a compass he didn't know how to read. He drove across the city first to the Multma Library, where Clara once said she liked to spend her quiet Sundays. But the rooms were silent, filled only with strangers and the soft rustle of turning pages. Next, he stopped by Voodoo Donut, recalling the box she once brought for the children at the donation event. He asked the staff if they'd seen a woman with light brown hair and a yellow raincoat. They hadn't, just crowds and noise. He returned to Rowan and Finch the next day, and the next, and the next, each time hoping Jade might soften and give him a clue. But her gaze stayed cold. She doesn't want to be found, she said one morning. Let her go. But he couldn't. Not with that note. Not with the feeling gnawing at his ribs. Not when it wasn't just pain anymore. It was love. And he hadn't known until it was too late. Portland became a maze of memories. Every street he turned held her laughter. Every cafe carried a shadow of her smile. Every quiet moment echoed with what he didn't say. Then, one rainy morning, walking through the Pearl District, he saw her, or so he thought. A brown-haired girl in a faded yellow raincoat stepped out of a flower shop, head bowed, shoulders familiar. His breath caught. His heart surged. "Clara!" He called across the street, his voice rising over the whisper of rain and engines. The girl turned, but it wasn't her, just a stranger, eyes wide, caught off guard, looking at him like he'd lost his mind. "I'm sorry," Adrian whispered, stepping back. And for the first time, he felt it. She was really gone. "Mistake," Adrian muttered under his breath as he turned away, his cheeks burning with embarrassment. The woman in the yellow raincoat hadn't been Clara, just another stranger with kind eyes and no idea who he was. Still, a foolish ember of hope flickered inside him that maybe she was nearby, that maybe he was just looking in the wrong places. He stood in the rain, clutching The Alchemist inside his coat pocket. The pages warped slightly now, from being carried too long, too close. The words she'd left behind, "Find your treasure," whispered through his thoughts like a challenge he still didn't understand. After a week of searching across Portland with no sign of her, Adrian expanded his search. He remembered a conversation once passing, casual. Clara had mentioned Seattle. A non-profit educational group there had offered her a job. She'd turned it down back then, choosing to stay at Rowan and Finch. It was a thread, thin, fragile, but it was all he had. Without hesitation, he drove north up the long stretch of I-5, through rain-slicked roads and the gray hush of the Pacific Northwest. The Alchemist rested in the passenger seat beside him like a guide, or maybe a question he still didn't know how to answer. Seattle greeted him with the same drizzle as Portland, but louder, bigger. The city buzzed with impatient footsteps and crowded crosswalks, its skyline towering above like a cathedral of motion and ambition. He had no address, no name of the organization, just instinct. He wandered through neighborhoods, checked public libraries, walked into used bookstores, asked quietly at coffee shops and markets, but no one knew a Clara Whitmore. And slowly, doubt crept in. Maybe she didn't want to be found. Maybe I was too late. Then, on a cloudy Saturday afternoon, as he passed through Capitol Hill, a flyer caught his eye. Taped to a lamppost, weather-worn and curling at the edges, it read, "Story Time for Immigrant Children, a reading and community event by New Roots Education." He stared at it, something catching in his chest. It could be her. He followed the directions to a modest community center, its walls painted a soft yellow, the sound of children's laughter spilling out onto the street. He stepped inside, the Alchemist gripped tightly in his hand, and then he heard her voice. Gentle, clear, familiar. And then the boy realized she was saying, "Sometimes the most magical things aren't in books, but in the people you meet." Adrian froze. There she was, sitting among a circle of wide-eyed children, reading The Boy Who Fell Off the Mayflower. Her sweater was simple, her light brown hair tied loosely, her expression radiant with quiet joy. She looked like home, like everything he hadn't known he needed. The children clapped as she finished, and she smiled that smile, the one he hadn't seen since the day she'd handed him a book and made him believe again. "Books don't fix people," she told them gently. "People fix each other." Adrian felt his throat tighten. He stepped forward slowly, as if a sudden move might break the moment. He didn't speak. He just stood there in the corner of the room, barely breathing, the Alchemist trembling in his hand. She turned. Their eyes met. Time halted. Her smile vanished. Her hands clutched the book a little tighter. And on her face, surprise, confusion, and a flicker of something that looked like hurt. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke, and yet everything between them was louder than words. Adrian looked down at the book she had once left for him, the one marked by her note, "Find your treasure." Now, finally, he understood. He hadn't been chasing a woman. He'd been searching for clarity, for purpose, for her. She had left not to disappear, but to give him space to find out who he truly was. And he had. Not at the top of his company, not in a sleek apartment or an elegant life, but here, in a yellow-walled room filled with laughter, books, and one woman who'd seen through every wall he had ever built. He stepped closer, not rushing, not pleading, just steady, holding the book like an offering, not of apology, but of understanding. And something deeper than hope bloomed in his chest, not fear, not longing, but certainty. He had found his treasure. Now he only had to ask if she was still willing to be found too. Adrian stood there, the alchemist in hand, his expression a mixture of resolve and vulnerability, one Clara had never seen before. The space between them pulsed with everything left unsaid, the days apart, the ache, the misunderstandings, all of it hung heavy in the room, suspended like rain just waiting to fall. Clara parted her lips to speak, but paused, unsure where to begin. Adrian took a step forward, then another. Each footfall echoed softly across the worn wooden floor of the community center until he stood just a few feet away from her. He stopped. His voice, low and trembling, broke the silence. "Clara, I'm sorry." Her eyes narrowed slightly, uncertainty flickering across her face. But before she could respond, he lifted the alchemist, holding it between them like a symbol. "I didn't know where you'd gone. I didn't know what you thought. But that day, when Sophia came to the shop, I told her to leave. I meant it. I didn't hesitate. She's part of a life I no longer want." He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. "But I didn't realize you were there, that you'd seen, that maybe you thought I still cared." Clara's hands tightened around the book she was holding. Her heart caught somewhere between the pain she hadn't shaken and the new hope rising in her chest. "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" she asked, her voice soft but sharp. He let out a breath, his eyes raw and unguarded. "Because I was a fool. Because I didn't know how much I needed you. Until you were gone." A silence followed, thick but alive. Outside, the rain tapped gently on the windows. Clara studied him, and in those blue eyes, once cold, distant, she saw sincerity and something more, remorse. Yes, but also love, quietly blooming. Before she could speak, Adrian closed the distance between them. This time, there was no hesitation. He pulled her into his arms, not tentative, not unsure, but fully, warmly, like he was offering her not an apology, but his entire heart. She stiffened, surprised, but didn't step away. She felt his breath against her hair, steady and real. And then he whispered, voice barely above the rain, "That first hug, I needed it to survive. But this one I need it to live." The words struck her like a gentle blade, slicing through doubt, through fear. Her eyes blurred, and she let go of the walls she'd built. She wrapped her arms around him and didn't let go. For a long time, they stayed like that in the center of a now empty room. Two souls once lost, finally choosing each other. When they stepped back, Clara wiped her eyes and smiled through tears. "I'm not coming back to Portland just because you hugged me." Adrian laughed a real, easy laugh, his face brighter than she'd ever seen it. "I know," he said. but I'm hoping you'll give me a chance to make things right." She looked at him thoughtfully, then said firmly, "Okay, but on one condition." He raised an eyebrow. "We don't just live for each other," she said. "We do something bigger. Not just books, not just hugs, something that helps people, the kind of people we used to be. Lost, broken, alone." Adrian didn't even blink. "Whatever you want," he said. "We'll do it." And from that, the Hug Foundation was born, a nonprofit devoted to mental health support, building community libraries, and helping women in crisis, those who had been forgotten, like Clara once was, or betrayed like her, or simply needed someone to believe in them, like Adrian once did. They returned to Portland not as a couple with romantic labels, but as partners with purpose. Clara returned to Rowan and Finch, though now only part-time. Her heart, once poured into shelving books and helping customers quietly, now had a new direction. Adrian, with his resources and drive, moved quickly. He hired a small but passionate team of mental health professionals, contacted publishers for book donations, and secured a small office space in East Portland. They named it the Hug Foundation, simple, heartfelt, a reflection of the moment that had changed everything. Clara designed the logo and open book with two arms wrapped around it, a symbol of comfort, of connection. Adrian handled logistics, building partnerships, reaching out to donors. But it wasn't building something meaningful was never going to be easy. And the Hug Foundation, as noble and heartfelt as it was no exception. Just a few months after launching, the first cracks began to show. Funding was tight. Adrian had already invested a significant amount of his own savings to get it off the ground. But the reality was harsher than either of them had anticipated. Running a mobile library, offering free counseling services, and supporting women in post-crisis care, it all added up quickly. Early donors hesitated. They wanted measurable results, long-term projections. And in the meantime, their operating budget was shrinking by the week. One late evening, Clara sat at a desk in their modest office in East Portland, surrounded by paperwork and numbers that wouldn't bend to hope. Her brows furrowed as she stared at the budget sheet. "If we don't get more funding soon," she said, voice tight, "we'll have to cut the mobile library, or worse, suspend some of the programs." Across the table, Adrian sat in silence, his fingers tapping softly against the wood. Then, as if the answer had been waiting inside him all along, he said quietly, "I'll sell part of my company shares. Not a lot. Just enough to keep us afloat for a few more months." Clara looked up, startled. "Are you serious?" "Adrian, that's your company, your life's work." He met her gaze, calm and clear. "The company was what I built to prove I could. This," he gestured around them, "this is what I want to keep. For you. For the people we're helping." His choice gave the foundation a new breath of life. But Clara didn't want everything to depend on him. She had another idea. They organized a fundraising event, Book Day, at Rowan and Finch. An all-day community gathering with readings, used book sales, and storytelling. Clara reached out to Jade, who had softened toward both of them since Clara's return. "I still think you're a little crazy for forgiving him," Jade muttered with a smirk. "But if it's for this, I'm in." On the weekend of the event, Portland gifted them a rare gift sunlight. Warm, golden light poured through the bookshop's tall windows, dancing on the old wood floors. Hundreds showed up. Neighbors donated books. Parents brought their children. Volunteers stacked titles across tables and booths. And Clara and Adrian, standing side by side, shared the mission of the Hug Foundation with anyone who would listen. Children from the mobile library came too. Clutching their favorite stories, they told how books had helped them dream again. Their voices were small, but their words moved the room to tears. By the end of the day, they had raised enough funds to sustain their programs for at least 6 more months. As the crowd thinned and dusk stretched across the city, Clara stood near the counter, watching the last of the sunlight settle on the worn spines of books. Adrian approached, carrying 2 Stumptown coffees, their old ritual. He handed her one, smiling. "We did it." Clara took the cup, but shook her head gently. "It's not that we did it," she said, her voice soft but sure. "It's that we're starting." Adrian nodded, his gaze steady. "Then I'll walk with you, step by step." And so they stood, surrounded by stories, laughter, and hope, not just 2 people who had once been broken, but 2 who had found purpose. Together. The Hug Foundation wasn't just a nonprofit. It was a promise that no one should ever have to sit alone in their own dark alley again. 3 years later, Portland had changed. Not just with the return of autumn and its brilliant red maples, but in something deeper, something quieter. At the heart of it was a single alley, once dark, damp, and forgotten, behind St. Elias Church. The same place where Clara had once knelt in the rain beside a stranger and offered a hug that neither of them realized would change their lives. Now it was transformed. A long mural swept across the brick walls, open books, clasped hands, rising sunbursts in warm tones. In the center stood a carved wooden sign, "Hug Alley, where healing begins." It had been Clara's idea, to turn their beginning place into a symbol, a space for anyone who needed a pause, a reminder, or a reason to keep going. Adrian, ever the builder, had made it happen. He'd hired local artists, installed soft solar-powered lights, and helped turn the alley into a quiet Portland destination, a place where people could write anonymous notes of encouragement on slips of paper and pin them to the Hope Wall, a place where a free bookstand sat, always stocked, a place where no one had to walk alone. The kindness wall had grown over the years, lined with handwritten notes and surrounded by wooden benches meant for quiet reflection. It now stood as the heart of Hug Alley, a sanctuary in the city, a space to breathe, to remember, and to begin again. That day marked the 3rd annual Hug Day, an event created by Clara and Adrian to celebrate and encourage simple acts of kindness throughout Portland. Outside Rowan and Finch, the street pulsed with life. Laughter spilled through open doors. Books were exchanged. Warm hugs shared between strangers. And messages fluttered gently in the autumn breeze as they were pinned to the wall. Children from the mobile library darted through the crowd, their small arms filled with favorite stories. Volunteers offered free donuts from Voodoo Donut and steaming cups of Stumptown coffee to anyone who stopped by. Clara stood among it, all wrapped in a simple gray sweater, holding her latte, her eyes glowing with quiet pride. She was no longer just the girl who sorted books in the corner. She was a co-founder, a builder of something beautiful, a community born from brokenness. A few steps away stood Adrian, holding the hand of their 1-year-old son. Oliver had Clara's light brown hair and Adrian's deep blue eyes. A child born of healing, of courage, of a love that neither of them had sought, but both had chosen again and again. Their wedding had taken place 2 years earlier, a modest, heartfelt ceremony at a small church in East Portland. Just close friends, no spotlight, no headlines. Jade, of course, stood proudly as Clara's bridesmaid, joking, "I still can't believe you married that brooding tech guy." But their vows were simple, sacred to love, to grow, to live not just for each other, but for others. Oliver had come later, a joyful surprise. A boy with a bright smile, always trying to chew on the corners of books his mother brought home. Adrian, still reserved with the outside world, had become a wonderfully awkward, endearing father. He learned how to change diapers, mix formula, and lull Oliver to sleep with off-key lullabies that made Clara laugh every single time. Hug Day wasn't just a celebration anymore. It was a reminder of where they had started, of what one moment of courage could create. As golden light poured through Powell's windows, Clara stepped into the alley, holding a small note between her fingers. She paused before pinning it to the wall. The alley was bright now, welcoming, filled with color and life. But in her mind, she returned to that very first night. The rain, the silence, the stranger curled on the ground beside the dumpster. She remembered how she had knelt, unsure, but drawn to him by something unexplainable. How he'd cried without sound, and how she had simply wrapped her arms around him. Not to fix, just to be there. She remembered slipping the wedding ring into his coat pocket. Back then, she thought she was helping a stranger. But now, standing in the alley they had transformed, she knew better. That hug had saved them both. Clara smiled gently, wrote on the small card, "One hug can change everything." She pinned it to the wall, where it joined hundreds of others, each one a thread in the quiet tapestry of hope they had built. Adrian approached, Oliver toddling beside him, clutching a picture book he'd taken from one of the donation tables. "What are you thinking about?" Adrian asked, voice soft as he stepped beside her. Clara turned to him, then to Oliver, and her heart filled with something too big to name. "That first hug," she said. "If I hadn't done it, we wouldn't be here. No Hug Alley, no Hug Day, no Oliver." Adrian laughed quietly and bent down to scoop their son into his arms. "I think about that every day," he whispered. "You saved me, Clara. Not just that night. Always." She leaned into his shoulder, closing her eyes as Oliver's small hand tugged gently at her hair. In that moment, for the first time in years, she felt completely whole. Not just because she had found love again, but because she had found purpose, a family, and a way to offer the world what she had once needed most. The Hug Foundation, now 3 years strong, had grown far beyond its early struggles. With the help of passionate donors, creative fundraisers, and a community that believed in kindness, the Hug Foundation had grown far beyond anything Clara and Adrian once imagined. The mobile library now reached across state lines into Washington, Idaho, and beyond, bringing stories to places where books were once a luxury. They expanded their mental health programs, offering free counseling sessions to those silently battling unseen wounds. And they built a small, welcoming women's center, a refuge where women could heal, learn new skills, read in peace, or simply rest without fear. But Clara and Adrian didn't stop there. Together, they continued to build not just an organization, but a life. Some nights, they sat side by side in the Hug Foundation's cozy office, Oliver asleep in his crib nearby, while they mapped out new initiatives, dreamed new dreams. Other days, they brought Oliver to events, letting him see firsthand that joy grows deeper when it's shared. They raised him with the quiet belief that happiness isn't measured by what you have, but by what you give. As this year's Hug Day came to a close, the Oregon sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky with rich hues of gold and fire. Clara and Adrian stood in Hug Alley, a place that had once been forgotten. Now, it was alive with color and memory. Oliver sat drowsily in his stroller, still holding the tiny book he refused to part with, his eyes heavy with sleep. They watched the last of the crowd filter out, smiles lingering, laughter still echoing in the air. An elderly man stopped to thank them, saying the mobile library had brought joy to his grandkids. A young woman embraced Clara, her eyes full of tears, whispering that the Women's Center had helped her stand again after being left by someone she once trusted. Each word, each story small but profound, was a reminder of why they had begun and why they never stopped. Clara turned to Adrian and gently took his hand. "We've done it, haven't we?" He squeezed her fingers, his voice low but sure. "No," he said. "We're still doing it, and I'll be here with you. Always." Their story had begun in the rain, one quiet night, one broken man, one hug from a stranger who asked for nothing. That alley, once silent and unnoticed, now stood as a beacon, a place of healing, a place of hope, a place where a single act of kindness had grown into a movement. Clara looked around, at the mural-covered walls, at the notes fluttering on the kindness wall, at Adrian, still holding her hand, at Oliver, their greatest joy. And she realized she hadn't just hugged a stranger once. She was hugging the world now with him by her side. Thank you for following this heartfelt journey on the Soul Stories channel. If this story touched you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe that true love can grow from brokenness and sometimes begin with something as simple as a hug, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to help us spread more stories of healing, love, and hope. Together, let's keep cherishing life's beautiful, quiet miracles, one story at a time.